First of all, I just want to say this has been a fantastic 3 days. And I just want to thank INTAR and thank Babu Trust and Margavi and everybody, because this has been a great, great 3 days. Very, inspiring. And I think what Liam said is the best part has been that there's, 40 countries or something like that? That has been made such a rich experience. So I want to thank you for having me here. It's really been great. This topic about where do we go from here, I feel like the answer is you have to come up with a collective answer. It's a collective thing to do, so one of the things that'll be nice that we can talk about that. And I think all I can do here is sort of give my perspective from as a journalist, someone who's written about this, how I see the problem and the possibility as well. So as a journalist, your job really is, or what you do, is you tell stories to the larger public, and hopefully you're telling stories that are grounded in some truth and some reality. But the sense is that you do help form societal conceptions about what to do, what is true, that sort of thing. And I think if we want to think about how to transform the future, we do have to spend a minute and say, what is the story that has governed care and sort of the globalization of mental health over the last 35 years? And what is the vulnerabilities of that story? And then what is the story we want to replace it with? A story that can be told to society that will galvanize society in a different direction. So if you look at the story that really has governed care over the last 35 years, we say it's the medical model. It's not a medical model, it's a disease model, which is actually very different. And the foundation of that disease model comes at a very specific time. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the 3rd edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And when it made that manual, it made a change. A big change in how we're going to conceptualize of mental disorders. So in DSM-1 and DSM-2, there were a lot of Freudian influences. There was a lot of understanding that social conditions played a role, psychological conditions. But DSM-3, for various reasons, the American Psychiatric Association said, we are going to conceptualize psychiatric disorders as diseases of the brain. And they're going to say one disorder is as distinct from another as one disease is from another. And now when you make this conceptualization, what are you doing? You localize the problem inside the individual and not in society. Okay, that's a big change. And I think and by the way, there was no scientific discovery behind this change in conceptualization. In fact, as much as anything, it was done for guild purposes, for psychiatry, American psychiatry to represent itself, rebrand itself before the American public as a medical specialty. They said, we're going to put on white coats. And who wears a white coat? The infectious disease doctor. So as much as anything, the founding moment comes for guild interest to rebrand American psychiatry. And think of one other thing. This is going to, in a way, become a philosophy of being as this unrolls. And they're going to say that if you're suffering from depression or anxiety, it's all in your head, and it doesn't even matter what your condition, your sort of life situation is. And we're also going to start defining normalcy very, very narrowly, because if you're depressed at all, regardless of what's happening in your life, or you're anxious, that's going to be seen as an illness in your head. And this breaks, as far as I can tell, with any philosophy of being that has ever existed. So if you look at, theater, you watch your Shakespeare, you read your novels, there's an understanding, of course, is that human beings suffer. We're emotional creatures. We're not in good control of our minds. And now the sense is normalcy is you are in good control of your minds. And if you're not, it's something wrong inside you, inside your brain. So once they get that conception, the American psychiatrists began to set out to sell that new story to the American public. First to the American public. What they immediately did is they opened up a new public relations department. They began holding media training programs to train their psychiatrists in what to say to the press. They began holding annual conferences where they would give awards to journalists who told about this new story of a new disease model. Now, as this happened, as they embraced this new disease model, who really loves this new disease model? Pharmaceutical companies, right? Because now the pharmaceutical companies see that you're going to take all these sort of ordinary emotions of distress, you're going to pathologize them, and now you can say it's a disease, and if you have a disease, you can get a drug approved by the FDA for that disease. So what happens monetarily wise? The pharmaceutical companies begin paying two groups. They begin paying the American Psychiatric Association. They help fund these media training programs, these PR programs, and they also begin paying American psychiatric doctors at academic medical centers to be their advisors, consultants, and speakers. Now, why do you want to pay academic psychiatrists to be your speakers? Because as they said, they're the key opinion leaders. They form the story that society is going to believe in. Now, what is the story the American public began to hear? It was this: we are discovering that psychiatric disorders are due to these chemical imbalances in the brain. We're identifying the chemicals that are amiss. Think about that. That's a story of great discovery. And we have drugs that fix that chemical, like insulin for diabetes. So now that is a story that does tell of pathologies in the brain, and it tells of great medical advances. And if this were true, I think this would be the greatest discovery of the 20th century. Just think about it. The brain is so complex, and psychiatry is telling us they found the molecules that are amiss in depression, psychosis, etc. Now this story, the book, DSM gets published in 1980. You can start hearing this story in 1981, 1984. There was a very famous book written by Nancy Andreasen called The Broken Brain, and she says this: this is the new conception. These are illnesses of the brain, like a cardiovascular or cancer, and one is as different from the other. And this becomes the new scene. People with mental disorders have broken brains. But you need to read that book real closely, because you know what she says? This is an idea. We haven't found the evidence for it yet, but we hope to find the evidence for it. So this was a hypothesis. And then if we go forward with this story really quickly, Prozac comes on the market in 1987. It's marketed as a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Depression is said to be due to too little serotonin. The drug fixes it. And all this drug is treated in America and the United States as a wonder drug. The pill graces the covers of various magazines. And we begin to hear this: psychiatry has made such great progress. Not only can they cure depression, they can make you better than well. And there were either some articles saying this: the powers of psychiatry are getting so extraordinary, they can maybe even give you whatever personality you want. This was actually what was promoted to us. Now, one other thing happened in 1987. In 1985, the American National Institute of Mental Health did a survey. They asked American people, what do you think about depression? You know what the American people said? It's an episodic problem. It's a problem of living. It will pass. Okay, that was the old conception. So when Prozac comes out, Eli Lilly gives money to the American Psychiatric Association, and with the NIMH, they conduct a new program called the DART program to change American thinking. They said that old thinking is wrong. We now know that depression is an illness of the brain, and it's underdiagnosed, this illness. It's undertreated, and we have treatments that are very effective that fix these chemical imbalances, and they talked about cure rates of 70 to 90%. And then they began doing education campaigns. They called them education campaigns, funded by pharmaceutical companies. That message was just pounded home over and over again. Depression and these other disorders are illnesses of the brain. They're underdiagnosed, undertreated, and we have safe and effective treatments. And then the antipsychotics come out. What do we hear about the atypical antipsychotics? They balance dopamine and serotonin, and if you read articles in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they said, and this is going to end this horrible disease of schizophrenia, and we now find that they can go back and live these good lives. So that was a story of unbelievable progress, and by 2000, you can see new surveys, and Americans said, we now know that these illnesses are, these disorders, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, are illnesses of the brain. They need to be treated with drugs, and they're very effective drugs. Here's how effective that story was in American society. Today we have 20% of our people taking a psychiatric drug on a daily basis. And if you look at our kids, by the time they're 18, it's about 20% have been diagnosed. So this is converting the American population into seeing the world in this way. And the majority of people now know that depression is due to chemical imbalances. So what's the next step? The next step, initially, this happens in the United States, but now we're going to export this story around the world. And the way they exported this story was this. One, if you went to the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, you would see about half of the psychiatrists there, or more than half, were from abroad, from all over the world. And they would be traveling there on grants from pharmaceutical companies, and they heard this illness story. Okay? And then they go back, and many of these psychiatrists, when they go back to start talking about this illness story, they get hired in their home countries as well to start promoting the story. And then the second thing is the pharmaceutical companies, working with the World Health Organization, began funding, depression screening programs, depression awareness programs, and the message began to be promoted around the world that these things are illnesses of the brain, they can be fixed with drugs, and that's how you start to see this spread of this idea. So then the next question is, so we begin organizing our care, our thinking, our philosophy, our sense of self around this idea, illnesses of the brain. And think about a couple things. The illness now, the problem is in the individual, not with poverty, not with housing, not with all the difficulties of life. In terms of a neoliberal thing, it puts the problem not on society. You don't have to worry about social justice, you just fix the individual. I also think it's an extraordinarily impoverished philosophy of being. But anyway, so this becomes the way we organize our care or organize our thinking. And one of the things, for example, this morning we were talking about the Convention on the Rights for People with Disabilities and the provision against forced treatment. So what does the scientific story say about forced treatment? They say you have to have forced treatment because the people diagnosed with schizophrenia lack insight into their own illness. They don't know what's good for them. So one of the things, if you talk about building a more just thing and honoring these provisions in that convention, you can't do it within this narrative. Because the narrative says, in fact, they're incapable of making decisions for themselves. And that's why you get this basically increase in forced treatment, outpatient commitment laws. But then the next step is this. Is it true? Is this story true? Do we organize ourselves around a true narrative of science or not? And I will tell you where one of my moments where I began to question that narrative came out of a study involving India. You all know the study. It was a study done in the 70s and 80s where they compared outcomes for schizophrenia patients. When I use schizophrenia, it's the diagnosis, okay? In 3, quote, developing countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia, versus US and 5 other, quote, developed countries. The first study was 5 years in length, and they came up with a surprising finding. Outcomes were much better in India, Nigeria, and Colombia, the developing, but it was India and Nigeria where the outcomes were really good. So this sort of stunned this was a study funded by the World Health Organization. It stunned the investigators. So they said, what could be going on? Maybe it's a diagnostic thing. And so they mounted another study 2 years in length, and they hypothesized this, if you read it carefully. Maybe the reason for the better outcomes in India and Nigeria and these poor countries, is the patients are more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotics more regularly, and in the developed countries, they're more sort of rebellious. They don't take the drugs as much. And maybe that's the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries. Now, that's a valid hypothesis. If you believe, as we were taught, and I used to write, that antipsychotics were absolutely essential for schizophrenia, then medication compliance, if they're like insulin for diabetes, which I wrote many times, then medication compliance should be associated with a better outcome. So in the second study, they measured medication usage, and what did they find? Now, this was never highlighted, this finding. They found that in India and Nigeria, very few patients were kept on the medications long-term at that time. Only 16% of patients were maintained on medications long-term. And then the researchers said, and even that's probably too high because they were lying to us, and actually very few, even it was probably more like 10%. And you know where the best outcomes were in the entire study? Agra, India. Do you know what percentage of patients were maintained regularly on antipsychotics? 2%. Do you know where the worst outcomes were in that study? Soviet Union, where there was the highest level of continual maintenance. So for me, I had just written a series for the Boston Globe which said it was abusive to ever run a study where you withdrew antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients because they're like insulin for diabetes, because that story was done within that conventional narrative. And now all of a sudden I'm finding a scientific story that belies what I knew to be true. Anyway, to go forward, when you actually now begin to look at this study and put it up, that conventional narrative under a microscope, it falls apart at everywhere you look. So for example, did they find that low serotonin is the cause of depression? They did not. That narrative has completely fallen apart. In fact, there's a man named Ronald Pies, former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times. He says, the chemical imbalance theory is a kind of urban myth, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. That's how much the chemical imbalance story has fallen apart in the United States. They're now beginning to say, we never said it. And if you actually look at the research, as early as 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health was saying, we're just not finding that people with depression have low serotonin before they go on the drugs. So you find that fell apart. Did they actually find the biology of any mental disorders? It's still unknown. We hear that these disorders got validated, but yet when they were creating DSM-5, if you actually listen to panels, they said this. They had this panel of psychiatrists. They said, have we validated any of these disorders in the DSM as real illnesses? They said no. That's been a failure. Now you look at long-term outcomes with the drugs, they're not good. And then finally it's this. We have been embracing this story of care now for 35 years in the United States, and what do you see? You see all the markers of the burden of mental illness going way up in our society. So in terms as a form of care and a way of thinking to diminish that problem of that burden of illness or that burden of distress, it has failed to do so. Now, one of the things I was recently asked to do, there was a work group in Parliament, and they were in the UK's Parliament, and they asked me to give a presentation on the rising disability numbers throughout the world. And basically you see, as countries adopt this conventional narrative, their burden of illness goes up. So you see it's not an effective societal response either, but it's not scientifically true either. So Liam talked about a moment. That conventional story in the United States has fallen apart. They're no longer maintaining anything about chemical imbalances. They're not really saying that they're admitting that the diagnoses are social constructs. They're admitting that drugs don't work very well. They're admitting the disability, the illness is going up. So this presents a time. What is going to be the new paradigm of care? What is going to be the new narrative that drives care? So it's opening up that possibility. And that's the opportunity here that I think we are sort of at the Berlin Wall moment, because that conventional narrative is collapsing. So, what did you hear over the last few days? We heard a different narrative, right? We heard a narrative talking about housing, social conditions, and if you start doing things like housing first, if you give people an income, you treat people with dignity, let them be autonomous beings. How many of you saw the thing with the Babu Trust in Calcutta, where the woman who was saying, I don't want to go back home, but they honored her autonomy, her sense of dignity. So you heard a different possibility, and it's a possibility that I love for this reason too. One of the problems with the conventional narrative, it says here, over here is the other. These are the people that have illnesses, and over here supposedly is the normal group. By the way, it's a very stigmatizing thing, but think about that. It's a story that puts us at odds with each other. Rather than recognize our common humanity, it separates people out as different, as other, to be afraid of. And part of the narrative in the United States is, quote, people with schizophrenia are violent. They go out of control. That's why you have to have them on medications all the time. In other words, we tell untrue stories about people, and we somehow separate them from ourselves, from the common humanity. And what did we hear for the past few days? about being brothers and sisters and that sort of thing, and seeing ourselves, you know, Will Hall started with sort of the capacity to go mad is in all of us. So I think the opportunity to be grabbed here is an opportunity to create a new narrative about people exist in relationship to the environment. We heard that the other day as well. The mind exists in relationship to the environment. So what do we need to do? You need to build better environments. You need to treat people with dignity. And also that story is also an optimistic story. And I'm going to be done. That's an optimistic story because it's talking about people finding ways to regain full lives, robust lives, etc. So from my position as a journalist, the story is how do we tell to the public a new narrative? The narrative you hear here today, but doesn't get out to the public. And just real quickly, from a journalistic point of view, I run this webzine called Mad in America. It has 3 parts to it. We carry scientific findings that basically do show that the conventional narrative is not science-based. We then provide blogs for people trying to rethink this, because I think it's a collective enterprise, and one thing we really champion is the voice of people with lived experience, survivors, but we want that voice to be heard by society at large, and we're trying to do initiatives. We have a MAD in Brazil starting, we have a MAD in Japan starting, we have a MAD for Spanish speakers, and the idea here is as these other affiliates start, we can all learn from these successful programs and help create a narrative that can be become a new global narrative. So, thank you.